Start on a new text today. Pericles and Athens by A.R. Byrne, The Golden Age of Greece, seen through the life of her leading statesman. From the introduction. Okay, I'll skip that because it's part of the introduction. The author's note. My most hearty thanks are due to Professor A.W. Game and Mr. R.H. Dundas, both of whom read this book in typescript. Okay, I'll skip that too. Favor comes to a man because for a brief moment in the general space of human change and progress, some general human finds in him a satisfactory embodiment. November 1932, FDR. Introduction. The background. In the middle of the plain of Athens, a typical Greek plain, formed of the alluvium brought down by the rivulets Kephisos, Eresos, Eridanos, from the surrounding hills, a miniature range of rocky hillocks breaks the surface. Highest of them is the spike of Lycabettos, from which you may look over the whole Saronic Gulf, the coast and mountains of the Peloponnese. Even on a clear day, pick out the citadel of Corinth, some 50 miles away. But of greater interest to early man was a lower rock with steep sides for defense, space on top for habitation, and copious springs under the rocks, where water could be got without far to venture or far to carry. The rock was not yet so flat-topped or so precipitous as it is today. Its present shape is due to the works of building and revetment performed when Pericles was a youth, but already it was an almost ideal citadel when Neolithic man first settled there and made of it their high city, the Acropolis. With such a refuge, which to till the good land round about, and the sea at Phaleron, far enough away to deter causal sea raiders, Athens prospered. During the Bronze Age, there were still many other similar cities scattered over the lands of Attica, but after being violently introduced to wider horizons by the late Bronze Age imperialism of Crete, the settlements drew together, forming at last one centralized state of Attica, with Athens as its capital. Thanks, men said, to the wise statesmanship of Theseus, the same who built ships secretly in Troezen across the Gulf, and carried out a raid of revenge on Crete after the last king, Minos, had fallen in Sicily. The Iron Age, which followed, was a time of storm and stress, with the crash of the Bronze Age monarchies and the emigration of rough Dorian tribes from the north. But even in the age, Athens was relatively fortunate. The main migration came down through western Greece. The little cities and thin-soiled peninsula of Attica roused no such violent cupidity as the treasures of Mycenae, are the rich plains of Thebes, and the crowded with displaced persons from the broken kingdoms of the Peloponnese. Attica, not without fighting, survived unconquered. Okay, the names: Pericles, Aeschylus, Piraeus, and other names, as in Greek, not as in Latin. Kimon, Leagros, not Simon, Leagros, Diocaidides, but Thaucidides, son of, okay, that's just a language thing. I'm going to skip that. The refugees are most of them passed on to found new cities on the west coast of Asia Minor, though some remained and intermarried with the people of the land, and while in the following centuries other parts of the Greek world suffered from race feuds, overcrowding, or the growing pains of new communities. The Athenians, with their comparatively spacious territory and homogeneous Ionian population, were happy enough for a time to have little history. So many cultures valued their oral history more than the written history because it was practical when it was we're living this life for this life. What happened before is Dorian, Corinth, and Megara on the Isthmus, Ionian, Chalkis in Euboea, Miletos, and other cities in Ionia, having become stabilized after the great migrations, began again before 700 BCE to pour out a surprise population to Italy and Sicily, to the northern Aegean, and later even the Black Sea. This colonizing movement ultimately upset the aristocratic governments under which most of the cities had settled down after the turmoil, for colonization led to a great growth of trade between colonies sided with an eye to good corn land. Kernels. They didn't have corn. Just to make that clear, because some people don't understand what that means. And mother cities in the rocky Aegean world, where the population still continued to grow. Hence arose new social groups and types. The parvenu, rich trader and sea captain, the noble turned capitalist, richer, more magnificent, also more greedy than his farming ancestor, the impoverished noble, unsuccessful in the new age, and especially the sailor and town worksman, less tractable and disposed to obey their betters than the old-time peasant, uprooted men, concentrated together in the growing towns, and ill to persuade, as the Greeks said, if it only became, when times were bad, the peasant could tighten his belt and survive, but the town worker was in immediate danger of starvation. The result, naturally, was a wave of revolutions. In state after state, during the 7th century, in those parts of Greece affected by the commercial revolution, the hungry and the dispossessed found a leader, usually a nobleman, disinherited or merely ambitious, to overthrow the aristocracy by armed force and redress, so far as in him lay, the wrongs of his supporters. Everybody's responsible for their own wrongs, but the justice for the worker is an essential part of every government. Not particularly national ways and a bunch of other things that people like to talk about. These leaders were the tyrants, a native word from Asia Minor, meaning despot, or as we now say, dictator. The word tyrant comes from a particular leader, doesn't it? The sinister sense of this word appears only in a later age, when the tyrants had outlived their usefulness. They were revolutionary leaders, often popular, but empathetically not democratic, though by breaking up the aristocracies, they paved the way for more liberal republics that followed. And some people will say the difference between that liberal and the words like that, it's not what you believe, it's how you believe it. But more giving republics could be a way to see that. America's not a democracy, it's a republic, by the way. SPQR. Such was the historical background of classical Greece. Athens followed, generally speaking, the common pattern of progressive and commercial states, but she followed it with a difference. At Athens, as elsewhere, the nobles and squires had reduced the old monarchy to a cipher and reestablished their control of the government through a regent or archon, elected at first for life or for a long term, later for 1 year. But at this stage, Athens stopped for some time in the 1,000 square miles of Attica, much more of a country than the territories of most Greek states. There was, for a long time, room for all. And that's what we find in this country. There's room for all, but a lot of people pretend there's not. Attica sent out no colonies. Nevertheless, the new age of commerce and overseas contacts, east and west, did not leave her unaffected. In the late 7th and 6th century, we find successfully a premature and abortive attempt at a tyranny. Reforms aiming at averting such a catastrophe, publication of the laws by one Dracon, and later a cancellation of the peasant debts by Solon, and at last, after tyrants of Corinth and Megara had already fallen, a tyranny at Athens. But there is something significant even in that lateness of the Athenian development, the wide area of the country which made colonization unnecessary, and so slowed up the constitutional progress, helped to support an enormous population for a Greek state at its highest point at Pericles' time, probably over 250,000 Athenians, in addition to many thousands of free non-citizens, and at least 100,000, probably nearer 200,000 slaves. Significant, too, is the lack of bitterness in the Athenian internal strife. Class struggles at Athens were not exacerbated by a conquest as in the Dorian states, and though bitter enough, yet in old and tradition-ridden Attica, even in the revolutionary period, as they never led to atrocities as in Dorian, Megaria, or half-Asiatic Miletus, the crowning success of continuity and modernation at Athens comes after the triumph of democracy in the lifetime of Pericles, in the fact that most, though not all, of the old families accepted and worked as the democratic constitution, a fact of which Pericles himself is the most conspicuous example. Now, I believe in a constitutional democracy. But in saying that, it's not the popular get to decide right and wrong. That's not what I mean. The tyranny of the masses, if it's not popular, it's outlawed. That's not right. Athens, in her prime, then had a population surpassing that of any other Greek state, had an internal solidarity unmatched in the history of that politically all too active people. One state had an even larger territory, Dorian Sparta, owning the southern 2/5 of the Peloponnese and controlling the rest of it through a system of alliances. But in Sparta's territory, the vast majority of the people were either free but unenfranchised farmers of the provincial villages or serfs, the helots, often bitterly hostile to their lords, which helot being a tad song. That very well could be where the whole thing was inspired from. Well, maybe not the whole thing, but this was especially so in the western territory of Messenia, which Sparta had conquered just at the time when the other states were expanding overseas. Sparta's potentially great strength was usually paralyzed by her internal conflicts, and in the heyday of ancient Greece, the question whether the nation would achieve political unity meant, in effect, whether it would achieve it under the forceful leadership in Athens. Greece failed to achieve unity, as modern Europe appears to be failing. Athens, under leaders whom Pericles was the greatest, tried to impose unity by force, and broke herself in the attempt. That is the Athenian tragedy. It remains to say something about the sources of our all too scanty knowledge of the great Athenian and its times. Pericles and Plutarch. And Plutarch is somebody that, of course, I will go into more detail on this channel, as in 4 months of programs. I'll try to have other programs going at the same time, mind you, but that will be the main program. It's like a 1,000-page book from the 1800s that I have. It is surprising how scanty these sources are. There is, of course, the life of Plutarch, a pleasant, readable 50-page essay by a country gentleman and scholar who lived, it is true, over 500 years later, but who had access to the whole body of ancient Greek literature, most of which is now lost. Plutarch quotes, in this essay alone, some 20 authorities, including 8 contemporaries, 3 prose writers, and 5 writers of topical comedy. Of these 8, we have only Thucydides, whose history of the Peloponnesian War begins in earnest 4 years after Pericles' death, after a brief historical introduction and a few comedies of Aristophanes. Of latter historical writing on this age we have only Plutarch himself. The muddle-headed, scissors and paste universal history of Diodorus the Sicilian, and the short history of the Athenian constitution commonly known, to Plutarch, and Aristotle's, though it contains so much shallow thinking and so many demonstrable blunders as to suggest the gravest doubts whether it can be by the great man himself. Now, Aristotle is necessary for the development of Christianity. Plutarch is necessary for the development of Christianity, and we'll see more of that when we reach that. By way of additional background material, we have the findings of archaeology, especially of the inscriptions, thanks now especially to the American excavators of Central Athens, and to two great American epigraphists, B.D. Merritt and the late A.B. West, with who Professor Wedegary of Oxford have carried on the earlier work of a line of great German scholars. The Greek practice of inscribing their most public documents on stone results in our having, despite depredations of ladder builders and burners of marble for lime, considerable fragments of public records of Athens, something like the proportion that one might recover from a rather badly bombed record office today. It may be also taken as a certain that what remains to be discovered is much less than what is now known. To these documents we shall have occasion to refer frequently. It reminds me of how one of the Chinese sanctioned masjid, I think actually multiple masajid, have translations of the Quran in Chinese on the wall in wood. There's one I'm thinking of, but I think it was done more than once. The Chinese definitely wanted a translation of the foreign text to be present in the building. And if they're going to set up the imperial seal and stuff and, offer protection for the place, I mean, why not? I think that's a cool idea, having it up on the walls, translation. Haven't seen it done in English, though. But for biographical material, Plutarch, the author of the only surviving ancient book on Pericles, remains the chief source. Moreover, through their translations of Florio and North, and their numerous followers, he has been ever since the Renaissance probably the most read of all Greek historical writers, and has set the tone for much ordinary, educated, and non-specialist opinion on the ancient world. It is therefore necessary to begin with a warning. If we compare Plutarch's Thucydides' accounts of the events leading up to the World War, the only crisis in Pericles' life for which we have this great contemporary writer as a control, we find we not merely difference of emphasis, which would be natural as between a biographer and a sternly scientific historian, but incompatibility. Plutarch mentions with reserve a theory which several modern writers have adopted wholeheartedly, that Pericles, at the end of his life, deliberately involved his country in a war because of his political position, was being dangerously attacked through prosecutions of his friends, and he thought a war would divert his people's attention from certain deficiencies in his own accounts. In support of this, he quotes some lines of Aristophanes, who was living at the time. If, however, we refer to Thucydides, I should look at that in Greek to see if I'm pronouncing that right, we find not only no mention of this alleged reason for Pericles heading the war party, that might be merely a case for our austere historian ignoring personal details. We find explicit statements all the more convincing for being quite causal, not violent protestations, that Pericles was the most influential political leader in Athens at the time, so that the enemy, considering that Athens would be easier to deal with if he were eliminated, made vigorous but unsuccessful attempts to shake his position by propaganda. What then of Aristophanes? That Aristophanes was writing comedy need not discredit him. Many a true word is spoken in jest. Of course, I wouldn't look to late-night NBC as what really is the case in politics or something. But if we look up to Aristophanes, his own plays, we find that when the hero states his theory, his hearers answer, well, we never heard that before. Evidently, years after the event, the idea was still a novelty, which among nations of born gossips is conclusive evidence that it cannot be taken seriously. Evidently, Plutarch, an essayist, not a historian, as himself reminds us, was sometimes a little guileless in the use of his sources. He is capable of rejecting such wild stories as that of Pericles in his youth procured the assassination of his own party leader in order to succeed him, and in later years seduced his son's wife and poisoned his friend Phidias in prison in order to suppress his evidence. Such tales, he realizes, are incompatible with the respect in which Pericles was generally held by serious people, for instance by Plato, who knew scores of people who remembered Pericles and admired the man, though he disliked his policies. But Plutarch is an author who needs to be used with great care. He is widely read, but not scientifically minded. When faced with the conflict of evidence, he is inclined to count heads without asking himself if one witness is better than another. Also, his idea of a biography is chiefly a character sketch. The hero's birth comes at the beginning and his death at the end, but in between, events may be given in almost any order, to point a moral and adorn a tale. And see, that's what I mean by it was very influential in the founding of Christianity. Plutarch was not a historian, and he has many sympathizers. Could not be bothered with dates. Also, the picture given in Plutarch's Pericles is essentially a picture of the elder statesman in the last 20 years of his life. Athenian prose literature had scarcely started its career when Pericles died. In Ionia, it went back further, and when historians in the next century drew on oral traditions, these traditions were naturally the reminiscences chiefly of men who were still young when Pericles was 60. We have no first-hand glimpses of the young Pericles at all. For one thing, he was evidently a good boy, and did not give rise to amusing stories of early wildness. We do not even know the year of his birth. Plutarch consequently found all that his authorities always pictured Pericles as the leading man in Athens. The real reason for this was that even comedies did not seem to have been written down and kept until Pericles was already about 45. But Plutarch naively pictures him as already the acknowledged leader of the Athenian democrats from the very start of his political career. Pericles' life is thus very thinly documented, except in his last 20 years, for which we have a fair number of allusions from comedies, stories handed down by his younger contemporaries, and so on. It is relatively well documented only for his last 4 years, for which we have Thucydides. And one further warning: when the sources available to Plutarch did give personal details about Pericles, they tended to be hostile. Athenian comedy had to caricature. It could, after all, hardly be funny otherwise. In any case, personal abuse for luck was part of its old agrarian magical raison d'etre. With the earliest prose writers, the reason was more serious. First, they were, like most Greek writers, members of a leisured class, and usually anti-democratic. Secondly, Attic prose literature, apart from speeches, starts as a literature of reflection and criticism in a world gone wrong. Let's not look at things too rose-colored. Hence, apart from Thucydides, the only great Greek thinker to write of him from personal acquaintance, there is a strong tendency to hostility towards the man who has led Athens in the direction in which she has gone. It appears both in Plato and in Aristotle, and apparently it was strong among the 4th century historians now lost, whom Plutarch knew well. Lastly, the two contemporary prose writers, other than Thucydides, whom Plutarch quotes, were both non-Athenians and both probably hostile to Athenian imperialism. This is certainly true of the more forcible of the two, the pamphleteer Stesibratos, from the island of Thasos, which Athens had subdued, a resident in Athens, but violently hostile, it seems, to all Athenians, except small reactionary clique, who promised freedom to all allies, if once they gained power. The other writer, Ion of Chios, a tragedian, who also wrote memoirs, is a man of whom we would gladly know more, but his work, less pungent than that of Stesibratos, seems to have left less impression on the tradition. Stesibratos is the chief source for those gems of obloquy which Plutarch rejects. That he is right goes without saying. Athens loved and loves a good scandal, but a man about whom such stories were even plausible could never have had a unique position of trust and influence for many years, and that he did not hold such a position, even the comic poets testify. Their usual nickname for him was God Almighty, the Olympian Zeus. And the exaggeration of heroes into gods is, more and more common than people think. And we're finding more and more examples of divinized figures. At least in the phrase. It is our great loss, then, that even Plutarch had, as sources on Pericles, the man, only comedy, which caricatured our political writing, mainly hostile, are the tradition of the next century, based on memories of old men who were young when Pericles was already the prime minister. Pericles wrote nothing, and no one who knew him really well wrote a memoir of him. The tradition of him is rather like the physical portrait that forms our frontispiece, based on Roman copies of an idealizing bust, for in Pericles' time, realistic portraiture, like prose, was still undeveloped. In the circumstances, there is some danger that our idea of Pericles may be of a rather chilly and inhumane person. Even the Athenians of his own years of fame found him Olympian, and from the superhuman to the inhuman is a short step in thought. In his own day, he was respected and trusted as none other, but really loved only by a few, who have left no memorial. To this, his own character contributed. Self-effacing he was not, but one might coin the expression self-immersing. Athens, as he made her, was not only his life work, but his own most abiding passion, love to the detriment both of his property and of his family life. It was indeed, perhaps, his most tragic limitation that Greece, apart from Athens, meant no more to him than Europe to most patriots of the present day. But few moderns can cast a stone at him there. His business was her business, his recreation the devising of new means of expressions for Athenian art, song, athletics, and lyrical drama, that and conversation with pioneer thinkers of his time on the physical or social sciences. His intimate friends included Sophocles, Phidias, Anaxagoras, the scientist, Damon, the musician. The woman he loved was one whose intelligence was respected by Socrates. As a young man, he was a soldier of conspicuous gallantry. He had also a dry, ironical humor, which appears not only in some of his few quoted sayings, but in Thucydides' reports of a group, and his last speeches, a humor which is certainly not Thucydides' own. Olympian to the outside world, he may have been, but chilly, no. Even in Athens, no man lived more fully than Pericles. But if we know little of Pericles' early life, we do know chiefly from Herodotus, the father of history, a good deal about his family and background. His father was the admiral who crushed the remains of the Phoenician navy in the year after Salamis. His great-uncle founded the Athenian democracy. His great-great-great-grandfather bloodily crushed the first attempt to overthrow an old aristocracy and bequeathed to his descendants a family curse that was still heard of in Pericles' time. The whole story of the rise of democracy in Athens is bound up with the history of that great family. For a candid historian, it is necessary in a biography of Pericles to use the word probably, more often than one would wish. But no figure more clearly invites the attempt in the terms of reference of this series, by way of a biography of a great man, to open up a significant historical theme. So, when people try to criticize sacred history based on the idea that it wasn't universally agreed among all people that this was the case, they're often not talking about something that is proved wrong.